Gromit? Did that tree just speak Vietnamese?
The Wallace and Gromit series is widely regarded as one of the best animated franchises ever created, which despite only having very few episodes relative to its popularity, this really is a case of quality over quantity, being praised for its wit, creativity and heart, as well as pioneering the stop motion medium to new heights that previously weren't thought possible. Wallace and Gromit is a British stop motion series which was created by Nick Park. Starting off with humble beginnings in 1989, the duo were an immediate hit with both critics and audiences, and exploded in popularity, quickly becoming one of the most iconic British icons to ever exist, with their popularity becoming so influential that Wallace's passion for the Wensleydale cheese actually saved the real-life Wensleydale factory from closure.
Oh no, not cheese. Can't stand the stuff.
Not even Wensleydale?
And it was amazing just to have the power to make or break cheese companies.
And having just released their latest special in 2024, after 16 years since their last episode, and their upload schedule was worse than mine, I figured now would be a good time to look back on the series and then rank each episode from best to worst. Let's start off with the first episode, A Grand Day Out. In this series starter, Wallace is trying to decide where he and Gromit could go for their holiday, and after discovering there's no cheese left in the fridge, Wallace thinks of the brilliant idea to go to the moon, because as we all know, the moon is literally made out of cheese.
Gromit, that's it, cheese. We'll go somewhere where there's cheese.
And so the two construct a rocket ship in the basement and set off into the skies. When initially starting the project, Nick Park didn't have a lot of money, and so was working on his own whilst making the entire thing in his garage. This made production incredibly time consuming and slow. In fact, the sequence where Wallace and Gromit are building the rocket, which is roughly 4 minutes long in the episode, took Park 1.5 years to animate.
And there was one paragraph that just said, "There is now a sequence where Wallace and Gromit build a rocket." That paragraph took me 1.5 years to film.
Fortunately, two gentlemen named Peter Lord and David Spoxton saw the potential of Park's work and offered to help him complete the project with the help of their company, Aardman Animations, where the project would be transported to their production studio in Bristol, allowing for a much easier work environment and, most crucially, allow Park to have a team to assist him. Park also reached out to Peter Solis to voice Wallace. Initially, Park wanted Wallace to have a Lancashire accent similar to his own, but Salas could only do the Yorkshire accent, resulting in Wallace and Gromit to officially live in Yorkshire. Another iconic trait that Salas was partly responsible for was the design of Wallace himself. Because of the way Salas would draw out the word cheese, this inspired Park to start giving Wallace larger cheeks to match the pronunciation, going from the straight-laced face in this short to the more familiar design in later ones. In fact, you can actually see this design beginning to evolve in this very short itself, as you see in the earlier animated segments before Park had settled on the voice of Wallace, compared to those later on in the episode.
Cheese.
Just as interesting is the evolution of Gromit, who initially was going to be a much more animated character and would have been voiced by Peter Hawkins. But when Park began animating his first scene with Gromit, which is the one where he's acting as a support leg for the workbench, Park realised just how much emotion he could convey with Gromit just by the eye expressions alone, and so decided to make him much more grounded and serious, which I think was the better choice, as it helps the calmer Gromit contrast well with the much more eccentric Wallace. Initially, this episode was actually aimed to be around 40 minutes long and played out much more like a Star Wars parody, but due to how long production was already taking, Park settled on simplifying it down to 19 minutes. So back to the plot itself, once Wallace and Gromit land on the moon, Wallace finds this coin-operated robot, which seemingly appears to be broken. Eventually, however, it does activate, and is not too happy with how Wallace and Gromit have littered the place, and so begins to give chase. Wallace and Gromit just about manage to escape from the robot, and thanks to some torn pieces from the rocket ship, the robot gets to fulfill his lifelong dream of skiing, and presumably spends the rest of his days doing so on the moon. Well, until that 5 pence runs out on the meter, that is. There's a lot of great things to say about this short. The story is charming. The animation, though quite basic, still manages to convey a lot despite its limitations. I love seeing the finger marks and crumpled plasticine models, which highlights all the human efforts that go into each frame. And despite having no facial expressions to work with, you perfectly feel the robot's emotions. The way it drops its arms in sadness, to the anger as it strops its arms about. And despite not being anywhere near as spectacular as the later entries, this episode still offers a lot of charm. And I've always loved that little visual of the mice putting on their sunglasses. I don't know why, it just always tickles me. But at the same time, this episode does very much have a amateur feel to it. The animation can be quite janky in places, Salas hasn't quite perfected his vocal range with Wallace yet, the music is pretty basic for what would later come, and the flow of the episode does feel a little clunky, in what I can only describe as there being a lot of dead air moments. Like when a scene lingers for a few seconds too long, or there just isn't too much happening on screen. Despite this, however, the short was a huge hit, both critically and with audiences, even earning an Oscar nomination. But unfortunately it didn't win, and Park ended up losing to, well, himself, with his other series Creature Comforts taking the win. By the way, Creature Comforts is a fantastic series which I also recommend checking out. I do want to do a proper review on that at some point.
Do you like lions as well then? Do you like steaks and chips with lions with it?
Not with lions, Andrew, no.
But for now, onwards to the next episode. The Wrong Trousers is the perfect sequel. It does everything that made the first episode great, but does it even better. And that's just not my words. Even Aardman Animation's co-founder, David Spoxton, said so himself, stating, "A Grand Day Out was sort of a student film. To an extent you can pick it apart. Trousers was a whole league higher up the food chain in terms of production values and storytelling." In this episode, Wallace and Gromit are running short of funds, so Wallace decides to rent out the spare bedroom in order to provide some extra income. The new tenant is a small penguin who doesn't speak, and though Wallace appears to be delighted with the new resident, Gromit has his suspicions that something isn't quite right. The first thing you'll notice with this episode is that the designs of the characters have been updated to what would now be their iconic look. Wallace has more pronounced cheeks to give him more facial expressions, and Gromit has had his nose slightly reduced in size, and the top of his head widened to allow for better brow expression. Fun fact, I believe this is the only episode in the series to show Gromit actually having a mouth, as we see him briefly eating cereal at one point in the episode. The animation has also improved, having much more complex movement with a smoother flow, coupled with the improved cinematography, which gives this a much more polished and cinematic feel. There's some great use of lighting, and more ambitious camera movement, which is utilised in a chase scene right at the end, which is still one of the most iconic action stop motion scenes to date. Julian Knott, who composed the music for A Grand Day Out, also returns to compose this episode, and his musical score has also been stepped up. Nick Park wanted this score to have a much darker tone than the previous instalment, in order to highlight the sense of threat. Another notable improvement from the first episode is the extended runtime, which increases from 19 minutes up to 30. This extra time allows for a deeper story, as we now have a mystery element with the penguin, and more time for character development, with the highlight being the emotional scene where Gromit leaves home. And man, this scene, the music, the atmosphere, Gromit's tearful look as he stares at the photo of him and Wallace, man does that hit you hard.
I didn't cry when my own father was hung for stealing a pig, but I'll cry now.
And it's moments like this that really demonstrate how the series can reach such emotional depth despite having little to no dialogue. Because yeah, upon rewatching this episode, I just realised how little dialogue there actually is. Because two of the three characters don't actually talk, there is very little conversation in this episode. And so apart from the scenes where Wallace is directly speaking to one of them, a lot of the scenes are reliant on pure visual and audio cues. And it's something that I've really come to appreciate upon rewatching. I also just love the Penguin character, who's called Feathers McGraw by the way. For a character who has no dialogue, or facial expressions for that matter, you just know there's something up with him, with that cold, deadpan stare he has, staring right into your soul, calculating, scheming. And of course, the fact that no one recognises him with his rubber glove disguise is just stupidly brilliant.
Good grief, it's you.
Which, yeah, going off from that, the humour in this episode is also fantastic. A lot of it is visual based, which I love, but even the dialogue stuff is great too. Such as Wallace, who despite having all the chaos going on around him, is more obsessed with minuscule stuff such as his reputation within the community.
You can't go taking liberties like this. I'm a respectable citizen.
And the condition of his wardrobe.
Oh my goodness, it'll ruin the woodwork.
And of course we have to talk about that final chase scene. It was an incredibly ambitious sequence for stop motion at the time, and still remains one of the most iconic scenes in stop motion history. From the action, to the visuals, the gags, the music, the way Gromit lays down infinite track in front of him, it's just all absolutely spectacular.
Hang in there, Gromit. Everything's under control.
It's a fantastic ending to a fantastic episode. And once again, this episode was also nominated for an Oscar, but this time, it actually won it. Smiling Gromit can't hurt you. Smiling Gromit can't hurt you. Truly setting the bar for what the rest of the series could achieve. A close shave once again takes everything which made the previous episodes great, but now adds even more polish, increasing the stakes, upping the pacing, and elevating the stop motion to even greater heights. In this episode, Wallace and Gromit have started a new window cleaning service, but after providing services to a local wool shop, they find themselves getting mixed up in a crime wave of local sheep going missing. And so not only need to find the real culprit, but also need to avoid the law at the same time. We're introduced to new characters, Wendeline and her pet dog Preston, who are the owners of the wool shop. Wendeline is a first in the series as she provides a romantic interest for Wallace, something that unfortunately will be used as a plot point multiple times in the future. I like how her design is just basically Wallace in a wig, and how her name is a play on the window cleaning product, Wendeline, though I do wonder what her surname is meant to be a play on. They also befriend a young sheep in which they name Sean. Again, a little wordplay there as he had just been sheared. Sean the Sheep would go on to have his own spin-off series titled, well, Sean the Sheep. I've personally not watched this, but I've heard it's meant to be pretty good. Animation wise, the episode once again shows clear improvements from its predecessor. The movements are more complex, the lighting and cinematography is once again on point, the action scenes are amped up in scale and intensity, as for the first time in the series we actually have the use of an aerial chase scene. And even just down to the smaller things, like the soap suds here dripping down the clock tower as Gromit is trying to clean it. Love that shit. And Julian Knott once again crushes it with the musical score, my personal favourites being the chase scene, and the emotional track for when Gromit is in prison. This is definitely the most action-packed of the episode so far, and probably the darkest too, as we're dealing with a plot where the villain wants to murder a bunch of livestock to have them turned into food, something that would be fully expanded upon in Aardman's later film, Chicken Run. And the nature of Gromit being framed and being sent to life imprisonment, yeah, it gets pretty dark in places. But there are some little gripes I have with this episode, such as how quickly Wallace buys into the idea that Gromit could be a sheep killer.
You've really let us down this time, lad.
Like, isn't Gromit meant to be your best friend that you've known for years? Shouldn't you have a bit more faith in him? And then adding more insult to injury, where at the end of the episode, Wallace actually orders Gromit to attack Sean.
Gromit? Gromit! Go for him! Gromit! Oh!
And thinking about it, Wallace was also less horrified and more impressed at the idea of the sheep getting turned into mince.
It's a sheep mincing thing. Now that's clever.
The more I start to think about it, the more I'm starting to realise that Wallace might actually be a bit of a psychopath himself. Overall though, A Close Shave is another fantastic addition to the series. And it seems that as the series has gone on, the quality has gotten higher and higher. So the next entry to the series can only be better, right? Right? Oh, and by the way, the theatrical film release, Curse of the Were-Rabbit, I'm not going to talk about that in this tier list, as it's kind of a very different product from the rest of the series, and there's a lot to talk about with its production history, things gone on behind the scenes, and the sort of merging between like UK production and American productions. But I do plan on doing a full separate review of that in the future, and who knows, maybe I'll actually place it on this tier list once that full review is done, so stay tuned for that. A Matter of Loaf and Death. So whereas the last 3 episodes were released relatively close together, this one was released in 2008, 13 years after A Close Shave. And as a result, it just doesn't seem to hold quite the same feel as the original trilogy. The plot of this episode is that Wallace and Gromit have started their own baking business, and wouldn't you know it, there's a killer going around who happens to be murdering various bakers. And so Gromit must try to figure out who this mysterious killer is before Wallace ends up next on the menu. Though the look of the show is still very much the same, there are some subtle differences. Wallace now holds this sort of buck-tooth appearance, which makes him look a little bit more goofy, in which, to be fair, he did sort of have this expression in A Close Shave, but it wasn't until the Were-Rabbit movie came out that really amplified it. And sadly it seems that this aesthetic has carried over into the series, which personally I really don't like. The animation overall though is once again improved upon, but I don't know if it's an overall positive, as there are a few instances where they try these mid-air shots on the characters, and they just don't land. They make the characters look floaty, which just doesn't seem to blend well with the stop motion feel, and I think they could have been better off without it. I also feel like Gromit has a bit more facial expression in this episode, which though sounds good on paper, it doesn't really work with his typical calm and grounded persona, and almost feels like we're going back to the more zany Gromit that he had in his original concept. The episode also feels like it has a bit of a tonal inconsistency, as this is by far the darkest episode we've seen in the series, as we open up with an on-screen death within the first couple of minutes, a grisly death towards the end, and some really horror-like moments throughout. But then at the same time, it also seems to have some of the most slapstick and immature humour of all, which includes boner jokes, and the sight of Wallace's bare arse. Didn't think I needed to see that, but I suppose you can't make a bread-themed episode without showing off some buns. Though I did quite like this gag with the bomb, which seems to be a bit of a homage to the 1966 Batman movie.
Get that thing away, lad!
The plot itself also feels a bit stale, so to speak. I mean, Wallace finds a new love interest. Again.
It's not every day you meet the girl of your dreams, is it?
And it's incredibly obvious from the start who the real killer is, which takes away some of that mystery element which works so well in the previous 2 episodes. There's also a couple of plot issues going on, such as why did Wallace make Gromit return the purse rather than just taking it in the van himself, and it's just how Wallace instantly believes that Gromit bit Paella. Again, highlighting at how he's actually a pretty shitty friend.
I'm surprised at you, Gromit. I really am.
Oh, Wallace, my sugar dumpling.
Oh, and speaking of Wallace, I'm even more convinced that he's a psychopath in this episode, as this is his reaction when he hears that another baker was murdered.
Battered with his own rolling pin. Huh. Still, looking on the bright side, I suppose it means more business for us, eh, Gromit?
What the fuck?
And this is his reaction after witnessing his former lover get gruesomely devoured by a crocodile.
I think I need a cup of tea after all that. Care to join me, you two?
Well, that was fun. Who's for Chinese?
But hey, at least this episode ends with Gromit finding a new love interest who seems to be sticking around, so I can't wait to see what adventures they will all get up to in the future.
Always room for a small one.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
But yeah, overall, I just didn't feel like this short held up to the same bar as the previous two. It's not bad or anything, it just feels a little half-baked. Though the short did receive an Academy Award nomination for the Best Animated Short Film and an Annie Award for Best Short Animation. So yeah, I guess despite my thoughts, a lot of people still really enjoyed this. And speaking of things that other people seem to enjoy that I didn't... Okay, yeah, so this is where I think I'm really pushing against the grain on this one, as everywhere I looked online, people were absolutely glazing this episode, or should I say film, as this one has a runtime of 72 minutes, which is over double the length of the previous episodes. But at 72 minutes, does that really qualify it as a film? As Curse of the Were-Rabbit ran for 85 minutes, but then again, things such as The Land Before Time only had a runtime of 68 minutes, so I guess, yeah, it should be classed as a film? But yeah, everywhere I've been looking, people have been absolutely praising this left, right and centre. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of good to say about it, but I also think people are ignoring its obvious flaws. This film is actually a first in the Wallace and Gromit series, as it is acting as a direct sequel to a previous instalment, that being The Wrong Trousers, and opens up immediately where the first left off, with Feathers having been caught and taken to jail, where he now plots revenge on Wallace and Gromit for putting him there. It's actually a pretty strong opening. We then cut forward in time where Wallace has invented a robot garden gnome named Norbot,
Call me Norbot.
who becomes a little bit of a celebrity amongst the local residents. Feathers notices this from within his prison cell and remotely hacks into Norbot in order to help him not only break out of prison, but to also reclaim the diamond that he tried to steal before. Alright, so let's start with the good. Despite being 16 years since the last short, it really doesn't feel like Wallace and Gromit left our screens, as everything feels very much the same to the original series. Aside from Curse of the Were-Rabbit, which was a cinema-released film, Vengeance Most Fowl is the most grand scale we've had in the TV series. The animation is looking absolutely fantastic, and the sets are the best they've ever looked. I do like the design of Norbot. It has that friendly, but also uncanny creepy look to him, especially when he gets the blacked out eyes once he's been hacked, really giving off some of those horror vibes right there. One thing I do have to appreciate is, despite how far the quality and technological improvements have come, you still see... Fire alarm went off. You still see the fingerprint marks and the crumpling of the characters as they've been pushed and pulled in each frame, highlighting that human effort that goes into stop motion animation. And this was actually an intended creative choice, as with this being a direct sequel to The Wrong Trousers, which came out in 1993, the team wanted to try and keep the look as similar as possible, and thus tried to keep the filmmaking process the same, which I actually really respect.
Nick Park personally pushes one fingerprint into each puppet that's made before the film, and then the rest of the team work on top of that. That's not actually true.
Though despite these efforts to keep the animation as traditional as possible, this is also notable for having the most CGI used in the series. Now, I'm not against the use of CGI, as when used correctly it can make for some nice effects that wouldn't be possible with traditional stop motion, and is essentially required for some scenes which involve large amounts of water, as animating stop motion water would be a hugely immense task, and using actual water around the plasticine models could cause damage to them. This is ultimately what led to the decision to have the 2006 film, Flushed Away, animated in CG. But I do feel it's used a little too much in places, which is disappointing as it is a little distracting. Like, did you really need to use the CGI for the milk on Gromit? Like, remember in the older shorts when pouring the tea was stop motion, and the stop motion suds from the clock tower? Like, come on, you could have stop motioned this. Julian Knott also returns to compose the score, alongside Lorne Balfe, who provided the additional music in Curse of the Were-Rabbit. Overall, I do really like it, as there are some really great scores in here.
Oh, we're jolly useful Norbots, we do all sorts of stuff.
And I do like how the classic Wallace and Gromit theme is mixed into certain moments. It's also worth noting that Wallace now has a new voice actor, as his previous voice actor, Peter Sallis, retired from voice acting in 2012 due to ill health and sadly passed away in 2017. Rest in peace, Peter, you absolute legend. Wallace would now be voiced by Ben Whitehead, who had actually been voicing the character since 2009 in other forms of media, and even voiced Hutch in 2005's film Curse of the Were-Rabbit.
Oh, I do like a bit of gorgonzola.
I think Ben does a fantastic job at replicating Sallis, and even though there are some subtle differences here and there, most people that I spoke to who watched Vengeance Most Foul didn't even realise the VA had changed.
Lovely cuppa, Gromit, but a slightly diesely aftertaste, perhaps.
Morning, Gromit. How's my favourite pooch,
So overall, on a technical level, I'd say I really like this. Where my issues arise, however, are with the plot itself. And when I say plot, I specifically mean the feathers side of things. It really feels like it was shoehorned in for the sake of marketing. And even though the title and marketing would have you believe this is the main plot, it honestly feels like it was an afterthought, with the original plot simply being around the gnomes. And for that part, it works pretty well. Wallace creates a new invention, it starts off well, then goes a bit AWOL, and it's up to him and Gromit to rein it back in. It's a simple yet effective story, and I like how it even has a little bit of an arc for Wallace as he learns that you don't need an invention for everything, even for giving your best friend a pat on the head. But then they decide to add back feathers from the wrong trousers, and have him be the main antagonist of the film. And this was a bit of a shock, as it was the first time in the series that they've brought back a previous villain. My guess as to why they did this is because the original plot was starting to increasingly grow in scale and budget, and so in order to guarantee more people would tune in, they decided to add Feathers into the fray, as he is arguably the most popular character in the series besides Wallace and Gromit. And so as a result, you had these two separate plots awkwardly merged together, as during the second act, Feathers is barely doing anything in the story, other than just sitting on the sidelines while the gnomes are causing havoc. And his inclusion in this leads to plot holes and many luck factors in order for his plan to happen. Which, just for context, Feathers' plan in the episode goes that he hacks into Norbot, uses it to create an army of Norbots, in which they all break Feathers out of prison, so he can then steal back the diamond, which he swapped out of the bag for a turnip, and hid the original diamond in a teapot. Now for this plan to succeed, there had to be an insane amount of luck factors to occur, such as Gromit just happening to plug Norbert into the PC to charge it so Feathers can hack into it, even though Gromit could have used any electrical output in the house, the fact that the computer Feathers uses at the police station has the capability to even remotely access Wallace's PC, the fact that Feathers was able to guess Wallace's password on the final attempt, nice callback to the first episode by the way. The fact that once logged into Wallace's PC, Feathers is able to reprogram the gnome because Wallace had already programmed an evil mode for it. The fact that no one bothered to check the bag just to confirm that the diamond was still actually in it. Wallace just hands over the bag to the police, says that the diamond is in it, and they just take his word for it. Did they not want to confirm he was telling the truth? Did they not want to check the diamond for any potential damages? Did they not want to take it out of the bag so they could put it on display again? The fact that Wallace was an avid tea drinker and Feathers had even witnessed him drinking tea sure was a big gamble to hide the diamond inside that teapot. In fact, we do see them drinking tea after the events of Wrong Trousers, so did they just not see it was in the teapot when making the tea? And how did Feathers even make the swap in the first place? It's never actually shown in the flashback. We just assume he's somehow wriggled free, made the swap without no one noticing, and then just tied himself back up? It just feels like there was so much stretch and disbelief that had to take place in order for this plan to succeed. And then there are just other plot issues I had too, such as being able to reset all of the Norbots by simply hitting them with a boomerang seems pretty lazy. How no one noticed that Feathers had escaped prison, despite him being regularly checked up upon prior. The whole money issue is not resolved at the end, unless we're assuming that Wallace got compensation for the false accusations. But the thing is, Wallace is still technically responsible for what happened. It was his gnomes that stole the items and caused all the damage. Yeah, you can argue that it was Feathers controlling them, but then they would question Wallace as to why he pre-programmed an evil mode to begin with. So he's either facing a penalty fine or going to prison himself. So yeah, I just think this special would have served better as a standalone plot for the gnomes. Perhaps they could have called it something like Gnome Wreckers. Huh. But then I guess you wouldn't get the whole, say the line, Wallace.
Good grief, it's you. Again.
And the whole image of Feathers with a seal, which did the rounds on social media, plus the fact that Feathers gets away at the end, which makes me think that they definitely want to use him again for future installments. So if you really did have to include Feathers, it would have helped if he felt more integrated into the plot. I mean, in the film it's shown that he's been plotting revenge for a long while, but his plan is very sporadic, seeing as how he just happened to catch Wallace's invention on the prison TV. Maybe if he had broken out of prison himself, gone to Wallace's to seek out revenge, then noticed the Norbot and altered his plan to not only get revenge on Wallace, but to have his reputation destroyed amongst the community and have him thrown in jail instead. Then he could hack Norbert on the actual PC in the house, and the plot could play out pretty much the same. There are other issues I had with this outside of the Feathers plot. I mentioned earlier that I appreciated how little dialogue there were in previous episodes, and this one is definitely the most dialogue heavy in the series. I get that this is over double the length of a typical episode, so more dialogue is to be expected, but some of it really did seem like a lot of fluff, especially with the police officers, which for me, not all the jokes between the two quite landed.
Yeah, I've got quite a copper's gut myself, actually.
Oh, I can see that, Chief. I mean, I didn't mean I can see it.
I do also think at this point the trope of Wallace being oblivious to the dangers going on around him whilst Gromit has to figure out a solution is getting a bit repetitive. Though on one positive, I am glad they didn't try to shoehorn in a romance with Wallace and the police officer, as again, Wallace having a love interest had been done to death at this point. But despite all of my negativity, this was still overall a fun addition. The animation is as excellent as ever. I did enjoy the gnome plot line and even the subplot of Wallace being reliant on too many inventions, and Wallace giving Gromit that pat on the head at the end did give off really wholesome vibes. And I did laugh at the Ant and Deck joke far more than I should have. So I suppose if you just don't overthink the plot too much, you're still going to have a fun time. But for me, it's one of those situations where I think they could have benefited for a simpler, more focused plot and just trim back the excess. Okay, so with the reviews done and dusted, let's get on to the ranking. At the bottom for me, it's got to be Loaf and Death. It has weird tonal inconsistencies and is probably the most forgettable in the series. Then it's going to be A Grand Day Out. I know, it's the first of the series and has that amateur charm to it, but it's also quite rough around the edges in terms of animation and music, and the story is pretty simplistic. Next up is Vengeance Most Fowl. because despite all the issues I had with the plot, I still think this is an overall fun watch and is the best the series has ever looked. But despite its strong potential, it did fail to stick the landing. And then we have the big two, a close shave or the wrong trousers. I'm actually going to put close shave in second place and the wrong trousers in first. Even though close shave is better on a technical level and has faster pacing than the wrong trousers I think just hits the highest highs better. It feels more suspenseful, the emotion of Gromit leaving home still gets me, and I think the emotional scene here with Gromit leaving home hits more than the emotional scene of Gromit in prison, and that train chase scene at the end is still the most iconic moment in the series for me. But if you disagree and you were to pick close shave over the wrong trousers, I'm not gonna die on a hill arguing with you. Both are top tier entries to the series. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the Wallace and Gromit series. Feel free to leave your comments below on how you would rank each episode. And until the next one guys, take care.